I need to tell you, I'm not playing with my phone. I promised Kristen that I would record the audio, so that's what I'm doing before we get started. I'm not sending a text or anything. We got to tell everybody that. But I appreciate everybody being here this morning. Hopefully, things we have to say will be beneficial. The Super Bowl was this past weekend. Right, I looked, and I don't know how they verify these numbers, but what I saw in a quick search was that 102 million people watched the Super Bowl. That's a lot of folks. There's big money paid for the ads in the Super Bowl. It's just ridiculous amounts of money paid for your business to get a spot, an ad in the Super Bowl commercial. The halftime show has been talked about this week. I didn't see the halftime show, but I've heard folks talk about it. I've heard read articles written about it and talk about how immodest and vulgar the halftime show was. And so it's still cold now. I mean, typically we wait to talk about these things till it's warmer weather, but I thought with that being in mind that we would talk about modesty, modest dress, and just see what the Christian is supposed to do, what God says about that. It's still cool now. It's actually supposed to be up to 60 degrees today, but it's still cool now. But it won't be too long before the weather starts getting warmer. The trees and the plants will start clothing themselves, and then people will start unclothing themselves. And so what's God say about that? That's what we want to spend some time talking about this morning. We want to talk about living modestly in an immodest world. So we'll stop just a minute and thank you again for being here. I'll echo words that Cromer said. We're thankful to be here. We have a great privilege to be here today, and hopefully the things that we say and do will be pleasing to God, but also will be encouraging for us. We'll be built up and encouraged and go out into the world feeling confident and good about serving God and being pleasing to Him. Let's talk about modest apparel this morning. Modest apparel. The first thing I think we should say about modest apparel is there's some principles in the Bible that talk about these things. And so there's godly principles we need to look at. The first thing we'd say is that Ezra 9 and verse 6 says, "And said, O my God, I am ashamed and blush to lift up my face to thee, my God, for our iniquities are increased over our heads, and our trespass is grown up into the heavens." Ezra said, I'm ashamed and I blush because of the sins that I've done. And so that's the proper attitude we should have when we come to God. I mean, we should be ashamed of things we've done wrong. We should have the ability to blush. But notice what Jeremiah said in Jeremiah 6 and verse 15. It says, "Were they ashamed when they had committed abomination? Nay, they were not at all ashamed, neither could they blush. Therefore they shall fall among them that fall. At the time that I visit them, they shall be cast down, saith the Lord." In Jeremiah's day, the people couldn't blush. They were past feeling for the things they were doing wrong. In fact, instead of being ashamed, they were actually proud of how they were acting. And I think that describes the world we live in today. Things that people ought to be ashamed of, they're proud of now. And so the things that used to sneak down the back alley now strut down Main Street. It's a prideful thing in order to show off. And in this case, we're talking about our bodies. We're not clothing them properly. But are we, as a country, past feeling, past being able to blush, past being able to feel ashamed? I think we are. But now the Christian can't be that way. The Christian can't be that way. We need to have a sense of shame, a sense of restraint. And so with those things in mind, let's talk about what God in the Bible views as nakedness. We think of nakedness as being fully nude without a stitch of clothing on, but the Bible doesn't describe nakedness that way. But first, let's look at a couple verses in Revelation. Nakedness is a shameful thing, is what God says. Revelation 3, verse 18 says, "I counsel thee to buy of me gold tried in the fire, that thou mayest be rich, and white raiment, that thou mayest be clothed, and that the shame of thy nakedness do not appear, and anoint thine eyes with eye salve, that thou mayest see." So Jesus, in talking to one of the 7 churches in the book of Revelation, said that there's shame associated with nakedness. Now, he was talking about other things, but in the midst of what he was saying is there's a shame of nakedness. You don't want to show your nakedness. That's a shameful thing. Later on in the book of Revelation, 16 and verse 15, said, "Behold, I come as a thief. Blessed is he that watcheth and keepeth his garments, lest he walk naked, and they see his shame." So, again, Jesus said it's a shameful thing for somebody to see your nakedness. So this is symbolic language, but symbolic language is based upon facts, based upon true things. And And so nakedness is a shameful thing. Now with that in mind, let's go to the book of Genesis. You know, the book of Genesis is a good place to start out talking about this because we see man and woman when they were first created and the state that they were in. Now in chapter 2 verse 25 it says they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. So this is before they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They were naked. In this instance, I think they were truly naked without a sense of clothing, not a stitch of clothing on. But they were not ashamed. But then after they ate of that tree of knowledge of good and evil, after they did that thing, notice what happens in chapter 3, verses 6 through 10. It says, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and the tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also to her husband with her. We're familiar with those things. He did eat. We're familiar with that story. Notice it says the eyes of both of them were open, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together, and made themselves aprons. And the Lord God called unto Adam, and said unto him, where art thou? And he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself. Notice, they ate of the tree, they realized they were naked, and so what they did? They made themselves aprons to cover themselves. Then, after that, God calls out to him, where are you? And he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked. Even after they covered themselves, they realized they were still naked, and so they hid. Do you notice that? You notice that? They said they were naked after they had tried to clothe themselves with these aprons. Now, I won't try to pronounce the Hebrew word for apron. There's no sense in embarrassing myself. But there is a Hebrew word for apron, and I looked up what it means, and it basically means a girdle. You know, so basically like the modern day underwear or swimming suit. That's what they tried to cover here when they made these aprons. And when God came calling for them, they realized they were still naked. And so they hid themselves. If you go down to verse 21, apparently God agreed with them, because it said, unto Adam also unto his wife did the Lord God make coats of skins and clothe them. So again, this was after they realized they were naked. They tried to cover themselves with aprons. Then God made them coats of skins to clothe them properly. He wasn't satisfied with the aprons that they made, evidently. So he clothed them properly. Now, the Hebrew word for coats, I won't try to pronounce it, but look it up. The meaning is literally like a tunic that reaches from here, from your neckline area, to the knees. Now, I'm not making that up, and it's not just because I think that's a good idea. That's literally what the Hebrew word means. The coats that God made them covered from their neck to their knees. And so I think we're starting to get a godly principle of what we see as nakedness. If that area is uncovered, God views that as nakedness. That gives us a little insight to the mind of God. You know, in the book of Job, notice in verse 5 and 6, it says, is not thy wickedness great, and thine iniquities infinite? For thou hast taken a pledge from thy brother for naught, notice, and stripped the naked of their clothing. You see what Job's saying there? You can be naked and have on clothes from God's perspective. And so, again, our idea sometimes we think naked without a stitch of clothing on. That's not the same as God's perspective. You can be naked and have on some articles of clothing. We know that's true. If you ever go to Walmart in the summertime, you see a whole lot of nakedness. People don't wear clothes. But God views nakedness as not covering yourself adequately enough. Hopefully that's the point that we're being able to make here. Now we can go a little bit further, but before we go a little bit further, I just want to say, of course, we're talking about not what's worn in private. This isn't what you sleep in when you're going to bed, or at home in private where nobody's seeing you. We're talking about what's worn and what's going to be seen in the public eye. And so that's what we're talking about here. We get a little bit more insight when we look at what the priests had to wear in the Old Testament. In Exodus 28, verses 40 to 42, now these were the priests. Notice it says, and for Aaron's sons, thou shalt make coats, and thou shalt make them for them girdles, and bonnets shalt thou make for them, for glory and for beauty. And thou shalt put them upon Aaron thy brother and his sons with him, and shalt anoint them, and consecrate them, and sanctify them, that they may minister unto me in the priest's office. Okay, so there's clothes, there's garb, there's clothes that priests are supposed to wear. Notice it says, and thou shalt make them linen breeches to cover their nakedness, from the loins even to the thighs they shall reach. So the priest would be working up on the altar. They'd be doing work. I mean, it's a lot of manual labor that goes into sacrificing an animal, building an altar, killing an animal. And so they'd be moving around. And so what God said is that they're going to have on a coat or a tunic, but they also need to wear undergarments, these, we'd say breeches. They need to wear these breeches under their tunics so that when they're moving around and working, that their nakedness won't be exposed. Notice it says that it would cover from the loins even to the thighs. So the loins are generally the abdomen, the midsection, and the thighs run all the way down toward the knee. Right? That was what was supposed to be up under their coats. So God wanted proper clothing for Adam and Eve, and then he wanted proper clothing for the priests as well. In Deuteronomy 22 and verse 5 it says, "The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do so are abomination unto the Lord thy God." So again, our first point, we're just making principles. We talked about what the Bible considers nakedness, what God considers adequate clothing. And then also, here's just a point that I think we need to make, because in today's world, we have people, we call them cross-dressers. We have men that want to dress like women and women that want to dress like men. Well, what's God think about that? Well, God says that a man ought to look and act like a man, and a woman ought to look and act like a woman. There's differences. He created them different. Men are special and women are special. God created them that way. And he wants them to look and act differently. They're not supposed to be the same. And so there's another godly principle about clothing that we see. All right, so there's godly principles about modest apparel. That's what the foundation that we need to lay is that God has some things to say about modest apparel. The second thing we need to say is that there are some direct precepts about wearing modest clothing. There's some direct precepts. Now, precept is a rule, a law, a command. God gives some direct commands about wearing modest clothing. He's got some rules about that. Donnie read for us from 1 Timothy chapter 2. I want to focus on verses 9 and 10. And so I'll say before we dive into this, Paul was writing to Timothy specifically about women's clothing, but men were not off the hook here. The principle applies to us both. In 1 Timothy 2 verses 9 it says, "In like manner also that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with shamefastness and sobriety, not with broided hair or gold or pearls or costly array, but which becometh women professing godliness with good works." Okay, so there's some guidelines that Paul wrote to Timothy about how a person ought to dress. Now I just want to break these down really quick because there's three words that are used, or three phrases, and we want to talk about those. The first one is modest apparel, the next one is shamefastness, and then sobriety. Let's just talk about what those mean. Modest apparel. What does modest apparel mean? Well, modest apparel would mean well-ordering of your inner life that expresses itself outwardly. In other words, your character, the inside character, will show in how you dress. You dress modestly. It describes someone whose clothing shows forth discipline. And when you observe this person's clothing, you observe someone who is self-controlled and moral. That's what modest apparel means. Now let me ask you this question. Would that describe someone whose clothing exposes the majority of their body? I don't think so. Could that describe the modern day, even swimsuits? No, I don't think so. Could this describe the extremely tight-fitting clothes that leave nothing up to the imagination? No, I don't think so. When Paul talked to Timothy about modest apparel, that's about the opposite of what you see many folks wearing today. And so modest apparel should show discipline. It should show your inner character being moral, and your outward character should reflect that. The next word there is shamefastness. And so you see at the beginning of that word, shame. So that would mean you dress with a sense of shame. Remember what we read about in the Old Testament. They were past feeling. They couldn't blush. They weren't ashamed of anything. What Paul told Timothy is that, specifically here talking to the women, but the principle applies to men, when you dress, you ought to dress with a sense of shame. It's not to show off your whole body. You ought to dress with a sense of shame. It ought to reflect a modest character. Our clothes say something. Do you know that? Our clothes say something. Now, I've got a tie at home that you can press a button and it plays a tune. Well, that's not what I'm talking about. That says something too, but our clothing says something about us. If you don't believe me, let me ask you a couple questions. When people go to a job interview, what do? Well, they dress nice, don't they? Why would they do that? If our clothing says nothing, why would they do that? Well, it's because your clothing says something. You want to look professional. You want to look well put together. the interviewer ought to say, well, that person, they're taking this thing seriously. That's what your clothing says about you. When you go to a wedding, people dress up, don't they? Why do they dress up? Because it's an important occasion. You want to look right for the part. Clothing says something about your character. In Proverbs 7 and verse 10, it says, behold, there met him a woman with the attire of a harlot and subtle of heart. The attire of a harlot. Their clothing says something. They dress in such a way that you know what their profession is. And so our clothing says something about our character. The harlot dresses in a way to entice or produce lustful thoughts. So back to our verse there in 1 Timothy 2. So far we talked about modest apparel and shamefacedness. I want to tell you a story. A couple of years ago, maybe last summer, Crystal and I went to Sonic. We like to go to Sonic, drive in. And it was during the summertime, and there were about 3 teenage girls there. They couldn't have been older than 15 or 16. And they were just almost fully naked. And they were walking around in the middle of the outside eating area. And what they were doing was, they were walking around looking for boys. Now this is a true story now. Because they were talking to each other. We had our windows down. And they were talking, is there boys in that car? And I kid you, I kid you not, they were almost naked. And I had to almost hold Kristen back from going out to go talk to them, put some clothes on. And so we just left. I was so embarrassed for them, and I can't believe their parents would let them leave the house that way. But that's something that you can see almost anywhere you go. People aren't dressing with a sense of shame. Mary Quaint, you ever heard of Mary Quaint? You may or may not have. She was a London fashion designer, and she's credited with inventing the miniskirt. Okay? And here's a quote from Mary Quaint. She said, miniskirts are symbolic of those girls who want to seduce a man. She knew when she was coming up with that article of clothing what the purpose of it was for. The purpose of it was to attract the opposite sex. So your clothing says something about you. You need to dress properly, is what I'm saying. Listen, those in the world recognize what clothing can do. And so us as Christians, we should dress in such a way that it shows forth our good character. Men and women of God ought not to dress in a way that would cause lewd thoughts in others. All right, the last phrase we want to talk about there is sobriety. So modest apparel, shamefacedness, sobriety. What does sobriety mean? Well, obviously, if you're talking about, drinking alcohol or something, you say, well, no, I'm sober. So it's free from any intoxicants in that regard. But sobriety means using sound judgment. And so when you dress, you need to use sound judgment. Do you think about what you're going to wear before you leave the house? Sometimes I think there's people that don't give a thought to what they're wearing. They couldn't have looked in a mirror before they left, surely. Do you think about what you're going to wear before you leave the house? I've got some questions here. I didn't come up with these questions, but I think they're good to ask. To think about what you're wearing when you put it on. Is it too tight? Is it too short? Is it too thin? Is it too low cut? Does it cover me when I sit down? Not just while I'm standing? Those are questions we ought to ask. A godly person ought to ask those questions. Am I going to be covered when I leave home? Does our clothing profess godliness? Notice he said there, which becometh women professing godliness. When somebody sees you, do they think, well, their clothing professes godliness, or do they think your clothing professes the wrong message totally? What does your clothing say about you? Now, these verses have been directed toward women, and so you think, oh, men are off the hook. Well, that's not so. That's not so at all. In Galatians 5, verse 16, we see the works of the flesh. Galatians 5, beginning 16 says, this I say then, walk in the Spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the lust of the flesh lusteth against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary one to another. Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings, and such like, of the which I tell you before, as I have told you in time past, that they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. Now, that's a long set of verses, and I wanted to go here because, men, this applies to us. So don't think this is just an issue with women. And men, we have to dress modestly as well. Then these long list of things, you see some pretty bad things. You think murders, whoa, I am not murdering people. I don't do those kind of things. But you notice right in that list, there's a word we don't use often, but it's right here: lasciviousness. Lasciviousness. You know what that word means? lasciviousness means anything that could produce lewd thoughts. That would include how we dress. I can do a lot of things to be lascivious. It could be the way I talk. It could be just the way I act and move my body. But the way I dress will be included in that. If you're dressing in such a way that's producing lewd thoughts in others, that's lasciviousness. And notice, Paul said that they that do those things are not going to inherit the kingdom of God. You will not inherit the kingdom of God if you do all those things, but specifically today, lasciviousness. Jesus said in Matthew 5, verses 27 and 28, again, I think this is a temptation for men. It says, ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery, but I say unto you, that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. Jesus said committing adultery in the mind is just as bad as doing the act. So if you're looking at lusting, you got to stop doing that. So men, we got to stop doing that. You can't look at a woman to lust after her. You got to direct your mind and your focus somewhere else. That gets tougher and tougher in today's world because people are wearing less and less clothing, but you're not going to be excused. You got to take responsibility. You got to have a pure heart. You can't have a pure heart if you're looking and lusting after another woman. That's what Jesus said. And so, the conclusion I draw is that when a member of the opposite sex lusts after you, they have a problem. But if your clothing causes them to lust after you, then you also have a problem. And so it's a two-way street. It's a two-way street. Notice what Jesus said in Matthew 18, verses 6 and 7. It says, but whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. Jesus said you would be better off to have a millstone hung about your neck and to be thrown into the sea than if you cause somebody else to stumble. That's serious business. So that tells me that the way I dress, and if somebody lusts after me, then that's on them. They can't be doing that. But if I'm dressing, causing them to do that, then that's on me. And so I've got to dress properly. I've got to dress properly. Now, somebody could raise the objection and say, I could be fully covered, head to toe almost, and someone could lust after me. And they could, you're right. And so that's their problem. That is their problem. If you're dressed modestly and they lust after you, that is their problem. But the point here is that if we offend somebody, we cause somebody to stumble, then that's my problem. See what Jesus said there? I think Romans 13, verses 13 and 14 ought to be considered when we're clothing ourselves. Paul said, let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envy, but put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof. Now get what Paul's saying. Now this can be applied in many facets of life. So, if my issue is alcohol, if that's my issue, and I'm trying to repent of that and do better, then that means I may have to take the long way home. I'm not going to drive past the bar. I'm going to take the long way home, because if I go past it, I'm going to be tempted to go in there. Right? Or if I'm tempted to look at something inappropriate on my cell phone, that may mean that I get rid of my cell phone, whatever the case may be. I'm going to not make provisions for the flesh. But also when it comes to clothing, I'm not going to make provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof. So if that's, some kind of sexual desire, I'm going to make sure I'm not unclothing myself. I'm going to clothe myself so that there's no provision made there for me to do something wrong. I don't want to attract the wrong kind of character if I don't want to do something wrong. And so I need to quit putting myself out there like I'm selling if I'm not really selling it. Okay? That's what Paul said. Don't make provision for the flesh. So, modest apparel, godly principles, there's direct precepts. And the last thing we need to say is that we've got a worrisome problem on our hands. We've got a worrisome problem on our hands. It's not a new problem, but it is a disturbing problem that we've got on our hands. I am hearing reports from churches of Christ in our area that they are not only no longer teaching or talking about modesty, but that people are declining to serve in public worship because they don't want to see nakedness. I've heard stories of people that I know personally that won't serve the Lord's Supper in their congregation anymore because they'll see an eyeful if they go to serve the Lord's Supper. And those things ought not to be so. Those things ought not to be so, especially in the Lord's church. I heard about a preacher that I know who lives in Smyrna, Tennessee. And He went to a gospel meeting with another man from the congregation he preaches and works with. And he saw a young lady, and he told me, wearing one of the shortest skirts he'd ever seen in his life. And so he assumed it had to be a visitor who wasn't a Christian, but he found out later that it was one of the elder's daughters. And then to add insult to injury, he found out that that elder was serving as the preacher of the congregation. So we're not talking about modest dress, evidently. We're not even talking to our kids about it, or even ourselves. And so that brings us to the point that we've got a worrisome problem on our hands. I heard somebody else say that I think we have lost the battle on modesty. I just think we've lost the battle, so we might as well wave the flag and give up hope. Well, I'm not ready to give up the fight on that. In as much as we're talking about it here today, I'm not really ready to give up the fight because souls are at stake. And so some folks may think it's okay or harmless to act like the world, walk like the world, talk like the world, or dress like the world, but God calls us to be different. God calls us to be different. And so we've got a problem on our hands. We've got to address the problem. You know what Paul said in Romans 12, verses 1 and 2 still rings true. He said, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Your body should be a living sacrifice. And you should be conducting yourself in a way that brings glory to God. We've got to change our mind. We can't be conformed to the way the world does it. This is how the world does it. No, we've got to be transformed. We've got to renew our mind to do the things that God wants us to do. These words still ring true today. The world follows the latest fad, the latest style, the latest fashion. But the Christian ought to know better, and the Christian ought to follow God's principles. In 1 John 2, verses 15 and 17, it says, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passeth away, and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. You see that? The lust that the world contains, well, that's all passing away. So if we get wrapped up in those things, what the world has to offer, that's temporary, it's going away. The things that God has to offer, those things are eternal. The person that does the will of God is going to abide forever. And so the will of God is to avoid from all the things that the world has to offer. James 4, verse 4 says, ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. And so this verse should answer the objection, well, everyone else is doing it. I don't want to stand out and be different. James said, well, okay. Being friends with the world is enmity with God. And so if you're a friend of the world, you're an enemy of God. That's how James would answer that objection. Everybody else is doing it. Well, okay, if you're a friend of the world, just know you're setting yourself at odds against God. So, modest apparel. There's some godly principles, there's direct precepts, and I think we've got a worrisome problem on our hands. We need to be talking about it. We need to be making sure we're dressing ourselves properly. We've got to be teaching our kids and grandkids, those we have effect upon. God views these things seriously. Nakedness is serious. So, clothe yourself properly. Now, I've got 3 or 4 excuses I want to try to answer really quick that are oftentimes presented to us when we talk about modest apparel. Excuse number 1 is it's cooler in the summertime if I wear less clothing. It gets real hot in the summer, and so that should be a good excuse for me to wear skimpy clothing because it's cooler on me. I can get more airflow if I have on less clothing. It's just cooler. And so I would respond to that by saying, are you willing to throw away God's standard of decency to keep a little bit cool? That's really the answer, right? Do men and women cease to lust because the weather's a little bit warmer? Do you get a pass? Oh, I understand you got to wear less clothing because it's hot outside. I won't lust after you. People they're not going to stop doing that. And so we don't get a pass just because it might be a little bit cooler to wear less clothing. Would it be all right to set aside what God has said for our comfort? No, it wouldn't. I remind you, my family often brings it up. When I was a young boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, because I don't really remember it, but my parents went to a gospel meeting and the preacher was talking about clothing and modest apparel. And he said people wear so little clothing, they must be burning up hot. If they're that hot, They need to go home and get in a tub of ice water. That's what this fellow said at that meeting. And so that's funny, I think. But I think his point is true. If you're that hot, there's a bigger problem at hand. Wearing modest clothing isn't going to make you so uncomfortable that you can't conduct life. That's not a good excuse. Excuse number 2, it's the style. I mean, that's what's in style now. So it has to be okay. Well, God's word doesn't bow down to the styles of men. God isn't subject to what styles and fashions the world may come up with. Their styles may change, but God's is unchanging. So that's not a good excuse either. Excuse number 3. Excuse number 3 says, I'm on vacation. So therefore it's okay for me to wear less clothing because I'm on vacation. Maybe I'm at the beach, or maybe I'm fishing or boating, and so that's an excuse to not have to wear as much clothing. So to that I'd say, well, we may take a vacation from our job or for our hometown, but you don't take a vacation from doing God's will. You don't take a vacation from what He wants you to do. And so I'm not opposed to swimming and fishing. In fact, I like those things. I like boating. I like those things. But we have to remain modest when we do those. That's godly principle. Excuse number 4. No one will lust after me. You see me? No one will lust after me. I'm just not that attractive. No one will lust after me. That's an excuse that's sometimes awful. Well, I'll say this. Everyone is attractive to somebody. There is somebody that would lust after you. So don't just think, well, that's an excuse. I'm not attractive. Nobody will lust after me. And we shouldn't be so foolish to use that excuse. We can't read others' thoughts and minds, and so why don't we quit making excuses and just do what God said to do on the mat? That's what we should do. And lastly, I would say this. Excuse number 5, maybe, the activity I'm doing sort of demands that I wear this clothing. I'll tell you a story about my own family. I have my mom's sister. I have an aunt named Brenda. She's a pretty tall lady. She's about 6 foot tall. She went to Santa Fe School down the road here. And so Wayne Walters came to he was the coach there. The gym's named after him there. He came to my grandparents' house, had dinner with my grandparents, and said, we need Brenda to play basketball. She's 6 foot tall. She would dominate. Right? And my grandparents said, we're not going to let her play because she's not going to wear the short shorts that they wear playing basketball. And I think that is impressive to me because they like the sport. They like doing activities. They like for their kids to do activities, but you're not going to sell out being modest just so you can go play a sport. I'm thankful when I played basketball, the style changed and the shorts were longer. And I really do think that men don't have a tough as issue dressing modestly. I believe that. Just the styles have been so that men don't have as tough of an issue. I believe that women have a harder time finding modest clothing. And I'll say that I know that. I know I've seen Kristen try to find modest clothing, and it's tough to find. Either it's got a slit up to here or it's thin. That's a difficult thing. But what I'm saying is that God's got principles in place that we've got to follow. And I'm really afraid and worried that we've got churches that won't even talk about it, won't even touch on it. And when it's brought forward to maybe the elders there, they won't hear anything about it. I think there's some lines that are drawn in the Bible, and so it's, are we willing to follow what God said about the matter? For modest apparel. So as I said, we usually talk about these things when the weather's warmer, but the Super Bowl happened, and again, I didn't see it, but I've just heard reports that it was pretty vulgar, and they were wearing immodest clothing. And so 102 million people saw it. 102 million people saw it. And I would guess, there's no poll, but I would guess that 99% of the people that saw it thought that was probably okay. It was probably nice, and it fit the style, and it looked good. But as people of God, we've got to have our mind changed. We can't be looking at things like that to cause lustful thoughts in our minds. And men and women, we need to be thinking about the clothes that we wear when we dress ourselves. I'm thankful for your attention this morning. Hopefully the things we've had to say have been beneficial to you. Hopefully, by this point, you know me well enough to know that I'm not going to shy away from talking about tough subjects. I don't get joy out of talking about tough subjects, but if we're going to be godly people, if we're going to be pleasing to Him, then we've got to deal with tough subjects. We've got to deal with it, and we've got to know the right answer to it. We need to be dressing modestly. It shows our character. So, This hasn't been a lesson to talk about the plan of salvation. We haven't mentioned it. It hasn't been a lesson to encourage you to obey the plan of salvation. But we don't want to end our service without giving you an opportunity to obey God if that's your desire this morning. If you've not obeyed the gospel plan of salvation, you have an opportunity to do it. We recite it so often, but it's hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized. Have you done that? If you haven't, consider that. If you want to talk more about it, just say a word. If you feel like you haven't been living up to your calling as a Christian, you feel like you need the prayers of the church, we'd be willing to pray for you and with you this morning. So we just ask, if you have a need, come forward. I will stand and probably sing this invitation.